welcome to another episode of The Watchdog with me, Low-Key, here on BRICS. As you know, we are going against the grain weekly, casting a light on the stories which are marginalized by the mainstream media. For that reason, we would greatly appreciate your support, whether that is merely liking, sharing, and subscribing to this channel. But also, we hope that you can follow us on Telegram, where, as you know, generally people seem to have a little bit more free communicating widely with many people. We do not know how much longer we have a presence on social media guaranteed, but please do everything you can to support Mint Press and the vital work that it carries out. Now, this week we are joined by a special guest who is coming back for a second episode. He was very popular last time, but before we get into that, I would like to deal with this latest contribution by the human algorithm, the irritatingly ubiquitous Canadian academic Jordan Peterson, and his latest pompous, condescending message to Muslims. Now, we have let me just check the microphone is okay. Okay, and we have the brilliant Manar Adli on hand to help us with some of the clips. So if Manar, if you could get up this clip of Jordan Peterson and the message to Muslims, please.
Hi, all. I have been informed by many sources and
get that full screen.
Also observed online, not least because of discussions with a variety of Muslim thinkers, supporters, and critics, that I have developed an audience in the Muslim world. I would first like to say that I could not be more pleased or honored that such is the case. It has been so heartening to see that my biblical lectures, for example, attracted a large Muslim audience, and that the comments from the Muslim watchers and listeners to my YouTube channel and podcast have been so extraordinarily positive. And all this is lovely to see in the aftermath of the extraordinary Abraham Accords, which have laid out the possibility of peace between all the people of the book in an unprecedented manner. I have something to say as an extension of all of this. Please forgive my presumption, if you would. It is.
That's enough of that, Manar. That's enough of that. Thank you. We do not want the viewers assaulted with any more Jordan Peterson material
as your enemies
going through Google. I'm sure that they already have suffered enough from being completely submerged in this man's ideas. Now, I think it's important to focus on one aspect of what he said there. He said, as an extension to the Abraham Accords, he has a message for Muslims. Now, the Abraham Accords are, of course, the official announcement of collaboration between the governments of Bahrain, the governments of the UAE and Morocco, with the apartheid entity of Israel. Now, the very caption on that video carries the statement, presumably not written by Peterson himself, that, quote unquote, in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, Dr. Jordan Peterson suggests that the Muslim community can set a historical example by reaching across the aisle and making contact with whom they regard as the enemy. Now, as is his signature style to individualize macro issues, Peterson sternly reprimands Muslims, imploring them to take inspiration from the Israeli normalization vehicle, the Abraham Accords, and embrace other groups of people. Now, this is clearly an attempt to astroturf support for the dispossession of Palestinians in the name of religious tolerance. Now, what could explain Peterson's sharply pro-Israel turn? Well, I've been looking into this more deeply and have found the infrastructure around him and the forces behind this video in particular lead me to believe that it is a small part of a coordinated campaign to normalize Israeli settler colonialism among Muslims. Now, this video was produced by the Daily Wire. And as we know, the Daily Wire have signed a massive contract with Jordan Peterson recently. Now, this organization, aside from being founded by Ben Shapiro and others, the actual day-to-day running of it is in the hands of the chief operating officer, which is John Lewis. Now, John Lewis is a former intelligence analyst in the U.S. Marine Corps. And the Daily Wire also employs a former U.S. military intelligence officer, Wesley Schmidt, in its customer service analytics department. Now, the founders of the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Bowring, have both worked for organizations with significant connections to Israeli military and intelligence institutions. Ben Shapiro previously stating that Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. Now, before founding the Daily Wire, Shapiro was a Robert Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. His position was directly funded by Shillman, simultaneous to Shillman sitting on the board of the Friends of the IDF and pumping millions into the building of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Now, the other co-founder of the Daily Wire, Jeremy Bowring, was instrumental in developing the Prager University project, which was founded by Israel lobbyist Dennis Prager. According to the other Prager University founder, Jeremy Bowring came up with signature visual style. Now, Prager University, the CEO of it, is Mauricia Straight, who is formerly an agent of the infamous Israeli military intelligence unit 8200. The current senior editor and researcher at Prager University is Richard Lim, who was the deputy associate director at the White House under Obama and then went on to be a program analyst at the FBI. The Daily Wire not only shared founder Jeremy Bowring with the Prager University project, but also funders. Both organizations were funded substantially by the fracking billionaires, the Wilks brothers. Now, the Wilks brothers provided the seed funding for the Daily Wire and regular financial support for the Prager University project. Dan Wilks also lavished financial largesse on the Liberty Council, which has a Stand With Israel program that consists of tours of the apartheid state and includes briefings by Israeli government and military leaders. Both Shapiro and the Prager University have also enjoyed funding from the Bradley Foundation, which has financed a panoply of Zionist organizations, including ones involved in illegal settlement building in the West Bank. This leads us on to Jordan Peterson's connection to the Abraham Global Policy Initiative, which could then explain this fixation with the Abraham Accords. Now, Peterson has publicly supported the work of another fellow of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Richard Kravitz. During a period of resistance to U.S. military aid to Israel by a few members of the deeply complicit U.S. Congress, Kravitz published an article titled "The Murderous Anti-Semitism of the Effort to Kill Iron Dome" in the Times of Israel. This is where he published the article. Now, his concluded with the following sentence: "If this is not naked anti-Semitism played out very publicly so that anyone with a moral compass can see it, then nothing is." Now, Jordan Peterson not only gave this article his seal of approval, he publicly promoted it to millions of followers on his Twitter page. Now, Kravitz is also on the board of the Canada-based Israel lobby group, the Abraham Global Policy Initiative. This organization was set up in lockstep with the Abraham Accords and is home to several prominent supporters of Jordan Peterson. The founder of the organization, which has this umbilical connection to the Abraham Accords, is Avi Ben Lolo. Now, he's written about the supposed attempts to silence the heroic Peterson. Mohammed Tawhidi, who claims to be an imam, is also a board member of the Abraham Global Policy Initiative and a close friend of Ben Lolo. Now, Tawhidi has sycophantically lauded Jordan Peterson as one of, in his words, the greatest scholars that ever contribute to human thought. Tawhidi publicly promoted Peterson's Daily Wire produced message to Muslims with the hashtag Abraham Accords, suggesting a coordinated effort of sorts. Also, former Canadian Senator Senator and Minister and current board member of the Abraham Global Policy Initiative, Stockwell Day, has also publicly promoted the work of Jordan Peterson. It seems undeniable to me that Jordan Peterson's latest intervention is focused on selling Israel to a Muslim audience, and judging by the company he keeps along with the company that currently employs him, it was directed as part of a concerted campaign. Now, we are going to be joined today by the right, okay, I see. Is he outside the mic? Control should be facing him. Okay, well, let's give that a try and see if that is any better. So now we're going to be joined by the...
No, Kareem, that's actually worse. I would put the mic back where it was.
You put the mic back where it was?
It's your internet connection.
Okay. How is this now?
Yeah, that's great.
Is this better?
Well, the sound is good, but
the sound is good, but the picture's still bad.
Yeah, well, it's your internet connection, so
it's saying that it's full. Okay, well, we'll bring in Ben now, and okay. Okay, so Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to speak about the BRICS grouping. BRICS is, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This represents 41% of the world population, 26% of the world economy. We also know that it makes up for around 31.5% of the world GDP. And at the moment, we've seen Iran and Argentina also apply to join the BRICS. This would lead to it rising to about 33% of the world GDP. We have applications coming imminently from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and no doubt others. Ben, if you could first break down for us, what exactly is the BRICS program?
Absolutely. The BRICS infrastructure, it was created really to create a global alternative to the US-dominated financial architecture of the World Bank and the IMF. The BRICS system has its own alternatives to the World Bank and the IMF. And the way that these are set up is basically the BRICS Bank, the alternative to the US-dominated World Bank, uses capital that is split 20% between each country, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And one of the key ideological leaders of the BRICS was Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, left-wing president from the Workers' Party. He is leading in current polls to return to be president if he wins the election this October. All the polls show that he's going to win by double digits if it's a free and fair election, although there are a lot of reports that the current far-right president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is planning a coup. So we'll see how that goes. But the point is that Lula da Silva was one of the main leaders of the BRICS system. And then when Xi Jinping came to power in China, he has really advocated the use of the BRICS system to create an economic and financial alternative. Now that the US has sanctioned 1/4 of the global population, and especially now with the economic war on Russia, BRICS has emerged basically as this kind of new economic infrastructure, bringing countries together that want to get around Western sanctions. And as we see the US and the EU try to threaten any country around the world that does business with Russia, the BRICS is basically becoming the alternative to the US, NATO, EU bloc. And the US and the European Union are basically dividing the world into two. In this, to prevent a multipolar world, they're basically trying to create a bipolar world. And the BRICS is essentially this new kind of non-aligned movement, you could say. And that's why we see, Iran and Argentina are very likely going to join. You mentioned, Kareem, that potentially Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ethiopia, Egypt. Now, I think that's very up in the air. It's very hypothetical. I'm personally skeptical about the fact that they will join because, it would be difficult, I think, for Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, all of which are adversaries of each other, to be part of the same organization. But really, as the world is being divided up between the West and the rest, the BRICS is kind of representing the rest. I do have to say that Middle East Monitor is not always the most accurate website. They've sometimes had articles that aren't super accurate, but we have heard reports that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Ethiopia have expressed interest, but expressing interest in joining and actually applying to join is something very different, right? And we can talk about Saudi Arabia. What Saudi Arabia is trying to do right now is trying to flex its options to try to show the U.S. that it's not a complete vassal state of the U.S. Now, whether or not that's actually true, of course, is up for debate. I mean, Saudi Arabia likely would collapse very quickly if it lost U.S. support. But what we're seeing, though, is this global realignment. And even longtime U.S. proxies and allies like Saudi Arabia are in a position where they are flirting with China and Russia and essentially saying that they don't want to be under the boot of Washington anymore. So I think it does reflect the major political changes we're seeing in the world right now.
Thanks for that, Ben. I hope the sound issues have been dealt with and are better now. If they are not, please do indicate to me. What do you think is the significance of Argentina and Iran's applications to join the BRICS?
Very significant. I'll start with Iran. If you go back and you read Brzezinski, the U.S. imperial strategist and former national security advisor, one of the architects of the Afghan trap, the proxy war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, Brzezinski wrote a book in 1997, the Grand Chessboard, in which he articulates what he saw as the imperial strategy for the United States in the unipolar era. This is after the end of the First Cold War, the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. And Brzezinski said, he warned that the most important thing for the United States was to prevent the rise of a Eurasian strategic competitor. And not only have we seen one, we've actually seen two, China and Russia, and their allies. And in his book, Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski warns, he said, the worst case scenario would be an alliance between China, Russia, and Iran based on opposition to U.S. hegemony. And he wrote that in 1997. And here we are, 25 years later. And exactly what he warned about is what has happened. We are seeing the creation of this Eurasian bloc integrating China, Russia, and Iran. This is extremely important. China, of course, has the largest economy in the world. If you actually take a measurement of purchasing power parity, PPP, which is a more accurate measurement of the size of an economy, China has the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest country in the world by population. Russia is the largest country in the world by landmass, and it's one of the world's largest producer of oil, gas, wheat, fertilizer. It's a powerhouse of commodities. So integrating those two countries, China and Russia, is already very significant. But also throwing in Iran is very significant as well. Iran is a major Western Asian power. It has a very large advanced military. Its economy is also very advanced. It's within the top 20 largest countries in the world. And Iran also has a lot of technical know-how because it's been under sanctions for decades. The Iranian people are very, creative, and they've come to a lot of, interesting creative solutions to get around sanctions, building technology. In fact, in Venezuela, Iran has been indispensable in helping to create a new kind of infrastructure for Venezuela's oil industry, because the Venezuelan oil industry had been dominated by the United States for many decades until the rise of Hugo Chavez. So when the U.S. began imposing sanctions on Venezuela, it made it very difficult for Venezuela to continue operating its industry because its oil industry was using all equipment from U.S. oil corporations. So Iran has helped to create all of this independent, technological infrastructure that doesn't rely on Western technology. So the fact that Iran is being integrated into the BRICS shows that Iran, which also is now a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is going to be part of this process of Eurasian integration. And it shows that China and Russia are not going to allow Western sanctions to to prevent them from going an independent path. That's extremely important because until recently, until a few years ago, China had a much more cautious foreign policy, and it was afraid of doing too much business with Iran and Venezuela out of the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions. We now see that they're no longer concerned about that. China and obviously Russia, which is heavily sanctioned, they see that Iran is going to be a major strategic ally for them in the future. So in terms of Iran's membership in the BRICS and in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's an incredible historical development, and it's quite literally the worst case scenario for U.S. imperial strategists, these neoconservative figures in Washington. This is their nightmare. And now for Argentina, it's not as significant, but it is important. Argentina has the third largest economy in Latin America. It's a major economic power in the region. The largest economy in Latin America is Brazil, and the second largest is Mexico. And Mexico had previously expressed interest in potentially joining the BRICS, but Mexico is very integrated with the Western economies, and it's a member of the OECD, and no other member of the BRICS is a member of the OECD. So it's unlikely that Mexico will join. But Argentina, after Brazil and Mexico, is the next major economic player in Latin America. It also has a lot of lithium, which of course is going to be very important going forward in the future for renewable energy sources. Argentina also is a major agricultural player and especially a major producer of beef. And we've seen that in the past few years, China has become the largest trading partner of Argentina. They've been increasing their bilateral trade. And then, of course, the fact that Argentina is in South America is very significant because the U.S. government, for 200 years, next year is the 200th anniversary of its Monroe Doctrine. It has maintained this very colonialist mentality in which Washington says that all other powers have to stay out of Latin America. According to the colonial Monroe Doctrine, Latin America belongs to the United States. So the fact that the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, took a historic trip this February to both Moscow and Beijing, that was actually before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but he took this historic trip and he signed agreements with Russia, with Putin in Moscow, and he also signed agreements with China, meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing, and Argentina joined China's Global Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive global infrastructure project. So the fact that two major powers in Latin America, Brazil and Argentina, are going to be part of the BRICS, and the fact that they are two of the largest economies in the region really goes to show that the countries in Latin America are not going to tolerate the Monroe Doctrine. Sure, they might still have relations. Argentina is not going to break off ties with the U.S. They're still going to have cordial relations with Washington. They're still going to do trade with the United States. But they're showing Washington that they are independent and they're not going to tolerate its interventionist and imperialist policies in the region. And the last thing I'll say here is if Lula da Silva can freely and fairly win the election, and like I said, if Bolsonaro doesn't do a coup, which is a very real possibility, but if the election's free and fair, Lula's going to win. And him coming back to power in Brazil is going to be a massive tectonic shift in terms of the geopolitics of Latin America. And Lula coming back in Brazil and Argentina joining the BRICS along with Iran is really going to change the global economy. And it's going to really weaken U.S. hegemony. And we can't underestimate that, yes, U.S. hegemony is still undergirded by its military power. The U.S. has around 800 military bases around the world. But also U.S. economic power is another reason that U.S. imperialism has been able to maintain its hegemony over much of the world. And the BRICS offers an alternative to that.
Absolutely. And an interesting aspect is that with Iran and Argentina put in as sort of an expanded BRICS, you would have a grouping representing around 26% of global oil output, 50% of iron ore production, 40% of global corn production, and 46% of global wheat production. But also when thinking about an IMF report released at the beginning of June, which showed that actually the US dollar today only makes up 59% of global reserves, whereas if you look at, say, 1999, it represented about 70%. It made up 70% of global reserves. And recently it was announced that BRICS nations are getting ready to launch a new global reserve currency made up of kind of putting together of the BRICS currencies. So my question to you, Ben, is what is the significance of that? Because potentially that seems to me to be a major game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. BRICS already has its own bank. It's called the New Development Bank, and people call it the BRICS Bank commonly. And that is an alternative to the World Bank. And of course, people who know anything about the World Bank are probably familiar with the fact that this is basically an instrument of U.S. geopolitical power. The U.S. is the only member of the World Bank that has veto power over the World Bank's decisions. It's a very clear sign that means that really it's an instrument of U.S. power. And the World Bank and also the International Monetary Fund go back to the Bretton Woods Conference after World War II. And what we're really seeing is that the global political and economic infrastructure created after World War II is rapidly in decline and is being challenged with the creation of new architecture and new infrastructure. So the fact that Iran, according to a letter that was published by one of Iran's top diplomats, Iran has proposed creating a currency also for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is something that is kind of supplementary to the BRICS system. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization brings together China, Russia, and India, as well as Pakistan, which is quite incredible because, India and Pakistan are adversaries. But it also brings together numerous Central Asian republics, including Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Iran is now a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The fact that they're talking about creating a currency for trade is very significant because it's another sign of the Eurasian powers moving away from U.S. economic hegemony and going on their own independent path economically. And for the BRICS, which is an economic alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization began as a security alliance based on combating extremist groups and non-state terror groups. And it's become a political group and it's become economic over the years. It's kind of evolved. But the BRICS is expressly an economic bloc. And if they manage to create some kind of currency for trade, that would be extremely significant. You mentioned, the use of the US dollar in international bank reserves is declining. The fact that even the IMF, which is again dominated by the United States, is acknowledging the fact that the use of the dollar in international reserves is in decline really reflects that these institutions that have been dominated by US hegemony are in crisis. Now, I don't want to be, like a Chicken Little saying that the U.S. empire is going to collapse in the next few years. Obviously, this is going to be a decades-long process of decline, but we are very clearly seeing alternatives emerging because everyone around the world can see that the U.S. has been in decline for several years. When that began, and we can have a debate about when that began, but it's very clear that internally, the U.S. is becoming much more authoritarian. It's always been authoritarian, especially for Black people, for immigrants, but it's becoming even more authoritarian. We saw that with the massive uprising against police brutality and the brutal videos of police just driving their cars into protesters. We constantly see all these mass shootings, and we see police in Uvalde, Texas, who just sat around watching as this gunman was just massacring children. There are so many problems plaguing the United States. And when Trump was elected, he didn't really change that much, honestly. He governed like most presidents in this kind of bipartisan orthodoxy. But the fact that Trump was elected was a sign to a lot of countries around the world that the U.S. is not a reliable country. It's very unstable. They don't know what could happen in a few years, so they can't put their bets on the United States. So we are seeing this historic shift, and we have seen alternatives that have been created. Whereas as recently as 10, 20 years ago, there were no other alternatives. So it's going to be a process over the next several decades But that's why the US is declaring this new Cold War. And that's why, with everything that Joe Biden does, and Trump before him, but especially now, it's everything he does is about preventing China and Russia from having influence. We see this economic war on Russia, which is basically an economic iron curtain built around Russia. We see that Biden just took this trip to both apartheid Israel and Saudi Arabia. And what he was doing in both countries is not only, signing pacts against Iran, trying to pressure them to take more action against Iran, well, especially Saudi Arabia. But we also see that Biden was trying to pressure them to cut their ties with Russia and China. So the U.S. is so dedicated to this new Cold War because it recognizes that it's in decline. And in Washington, these warmongers, they recognize that one of the only ways that they can halt that decline, which seems inevitable at this point, is basically a new Cold War and forcing countries around the world to pick a side, either with the West or the rest, right? That's basically what it ends up being.
I mean, of course, the interesting thing is that when thinking about, say, the Cold War, you had a far less balanced picture in terms of actual power. For example, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank has carried out more loans to the global south than the World Bank has. In recent periods, China is the largest trading partner with Brazil, is the largest trading partner with India, who the United States would have hoped to possibly use against China. It's the largest trading partner with Australia. Australia, of course, is a key US ally. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, as you said, this is almost 70 countries and international organizations involved in it. There's also the 16+1 grouping, which is 16 European states, Central and Eastern European states, linking up with China. 11 of those are EU member states. So it's funny how there's a real dissonance between the picture which is painted in our mainstream media of China essentially being isolated, but when you actually compare that to the reality of state-to-state relationships, and even Britain, one of the aims among some concerning Brexit would be that Britain would come out of it being basically almost a captive market for US commercial interests. But actually what happened is it went from Germany being the number one importer to Britain to China becoming the number one importer to Britain. Could you just talk a little bit about that very clear dissonance between the reality and between the picture of the world that is projected often by think tanks which are funded by arms companies in the first place?
Absolutely. First of all, we should recognize of the top 4 largest banks in the world, all of them are Chinese banks. All of them are state-owned Chinese banks. If you look at the top 10 banks in the world, the top 4 are Chinese, and then you have JP Morgan Chase, I believe, JP Morgan Chase is the biggest US. Mitsubishi Group is the biggest Japanese, and then HSBC, I think, is the biggest British. But China, all of the top 4 banks, largest banks, are Chinese, and they're all state-owned. We're talking about $20 trillion of assets. I mentioned earlier that if you actually do an analysis of the size of the economy using PPP, purchasing power parity, which measures basically the purchasing power of people in the country in their own domestic currency, as opposed to just measuring everything in US dollars, China has the largest economy in the world. It's significantly larger than the US and continues to grow. Obviously, that's a better measurement than measuring everything with dollars, because people in China don't pay for things with dollars. So we have to understand that for a lot of countries in the world, the US is basically telling them right now, you have to pick a side. You cannot partner with China and Russia. You have to pick between us or them. And the US is surprised, and Europe is surprised that a lot of countries are hesitant and saying, no, we want to continue doing business with China and Russia as well. because the U.S. is based, it's still, U.S. politicians still, their ideology is based on this idea going back to the 1990s, when the U.S. was by far the largest economy in the world. There was no other game in town. There's no other competition. And especially now we see with the sanctions on Russia, the U.S. is really angry that countries continue to do business with Russia because Russia's offering them really good deals with oil and gas and wheat and fertilizer. So what's interesting is that this new Cold War that we're talking about, this geopolitical conflict, it's not only rooted simply in the political interests and the economic interests of each country. Clearly, that's part of it. The U.S. calls this great power competition. The Pentagon uses that term so much, they actually have an acronym for it. They say GPC in their reports, great power competition. But it's also rooted in a difference in economic models. And I think it's really important to understand that in order to understand the new Cold War. What the U.S. is doing, and Michael Hudson, the brilliant economist, has argued this, I think, very well, better than anyone else. And I've done interviews with him if people want to check them out. What the U.S. is doing is trying to prevent any alternatives to the neoliberal capitalist model. It's not a coincidence that neoliberalism emerged in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s at the end of the first Cold War. Because during the first Cold War, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Western capitalist powers were forced to allow a substantial welfare state and some redistributive measures and some power for organized labor because they were afraid of socialist revolution. This is at a time of decolonial struggles, national liberation movements around the world. And in the 1960s and 70s, around 2/3 of the world had governments that identified as socialist. Of course, almost all of them in the global South. And the U.S. empire was in this moment of crisis, losing in Vietnam. They lost the Korean War. And they were forced, the U.S. capitalist class and European capitalist class were forced to basically make agreements to allow labor to have more rights, to more welfare programs, the creation of the National Health Service in Britain. The European welfare state model has its roots in exactly that time. But by the end of the first Cold War, it was clear that the U.S. was winning. The Soviet Union was in decline by the 1980s, and then it was overthrown in 1991. And then the U.S. could impose this neoliberal model on the entire world. And ever since then, in the welfare states in Europe, those welfare programs, the NHS in Britain, pensions, the social safety net has been whittled away more and more every single year with more austerity. It's not a coincidence that moment of U.S. unipolarity, the unipolar moment in which the Soviet Union was overthrown, Russia was basically colonized. You had Boris Yeltsin, this U.S. puppet in power. It's not a coincidence that at that moment, that was at the moment when neoliberalism reigned supreme around the world. But over the past 20 years, especially in Latin America, we've seen the rise of economic alternatives to neoliberalism with what Rafael Correa, the socialist president of Ecuador, called socialism in the 21st century. Hugo Chavez also adopted that term, 21st century socialism. So we've seen new models. And then, of course, with the rise of China as a completely different economic model, China has a socialist economy. It's a socialist market economy. It's not the same as the Soviet Union. Not everything is run by the state, but around 40% of GDP comes from state-owned industry. And the major banks are owned by the state. All land is owned by the state. Infrastructure is owned by the state. And the state manages the economy. It's a socialist model, a new kind of socialist model. The U.S. really sees that as a threat to this neoliberal model that it has imposed in the entire world. And we see now that in Europe, the European Union has become thoroughly neoliberal and has adopted the same right-wing neoliberal economic model. And of course, the European Central Bank, which is based in Frankfurt, Germany, is basically just a reflection of the German banking interests and to a lesser extent, the French banking interests. And they are trying to prevent any alternative to this neoliberal economic model. So when we're talking about the rise of China and also to a lesser extent Russia, I mean, Russia's economy when you measure it in purchasing power parity, it's about the size of Germany's economy. So it's not the same level as the US and China, but it is a significant economy. And as one of the world's largest exporter of gas, oil, minerals, timber, fertilizer, and wheat, Russia is a significant player in the global economy. And so not only are countries around the world saying that they want to continue doing business with China and Russia because they want Chinese technology and goods and Russian commodities, but they're also saying, look, we can do business with these countries and they don't force us to privatize all of our state assets. They don't force us to cut social spending and cut the minimum wage. So when we're talking about this, it's not only the fact that there are these new economic competitors to US and European hegemony and this new infrastructure like the BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization and, in Latin America, UNASUR and the ALBA. But it's also the fact that countries are saying, we have done this neoliberal model for decades, and it resulted in disaster. Our economies were just whittled out, and they were extremely corrupt. And what happens is basically that the IMF and the World Bank give these massive loans to these corrupt right-wing politicians, and they don't use that money to actually build infrastructure. They use it to enrich their friends in these private corporations. And then these countries are saddled with billions of dollars of odious debt they can't pay off. And the response of the IMF and the World Bank is to say, well, you have to impose neoliberal structural adjustment programs. The difference is China and Russia are not doing that. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer as to see why so many countries are looking to the east instead of to the west. And the perfect symbol of this is that for months, since the beginning of this Russian special military operation in Ukraine in February, the African Union was being pressured by the United States, Germany, and France to hold a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Western-backed Ukrainian leader. And the African Union was delaying it for months and months and months. And finally, in April, the African Union agreed to hold a meeting with Zelensky, and only 3 or 4 leaders of the African continent showed up. It depends on who you consider the legitimate leader of Libya, because in 2011, NATO destroyed Libya, and there's 2 competing governments still today. There's not a central unified government. So depending on who you consider the central government of Libya, only 3 or 4 leaders of the African continent attended this meeting with Zelensky. 93% of leaders in Africa boycotted this meeting with Zelensky, which is a clear sign that they're not on board with this Western proxy war in Russia. They want to buy wheat from Russia. They want to buy oil and gas from Russia. They want to continue doing infrastructure deals with China. So when we're talking about this, it's not only about the size of the Chinese economy, which is the largest economy, and the size of these Chinese banks. Those are, of course, important. But it's also the fact that this new Cold War it's different from the first Cold War, which was explicitly a capitalist war on socialism in the first Cold War. But like the first Cold War, the second Cold War, it also has a political economy to it, in the sense that it's not explicitly a war of capitalism and socialism, but it is a war of Western neoliberal financial capitalism against this model of Chinese socialism, Russian kind of state-led capitalism based on state control of natural resources, and countries in the global south who say that they don't want to impose this financialized neoliberal model that the West has imposed on the world for decades.
And also it was, the United States going from being for 110 years the largest manufacturer in the world, losing that status. And then the effect of it was the deindustrialization of places like the United States and Britain. And actually, companies like North Sea Oil, which was supposedly quintessentially British companies, then becoming owned to the point where they became owned by, say, a Chinese state company, or the British Railways being owned by Dutch state companies or German state companies or French companies. But then also what's interesting to me is how the sharpening of the contradictions within the societies with inflation caused by this rampant militarism. You are looking at over 11% inflation and people having a cost of living crisis in this country, meaning that so many different sectors are ready to go on strike. And all of it actually can be traced in quite a clear way, not only to the political class becoming enamored, it becoming the complete consensus across the political class that corporations are better suited to deliver the functions of the state, but also the escalation in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. All of this is a direct correlation between workers' struggles in these countries and rampant militarism elsewhere. What do you have to say about those sharpening points? Because the likelihood of social unrest and civil disobedience is increasing literally by the minute in England, for sure. I wonder what the situation is like in the United States in that regard. As these things become more and more pronounced, we are going to see a real greater likelihood of the social unrest that the establishment in the UK and the corporate elite in the United States greatly fear.
Well, we have to understand, I think, two different periods in terms of the domestic economies in the West. I don't like the term West, of course, because it's always funny as someone in Latin America. I mean, Latin America is technically in the Western Hemisphere, but it's not part of the West. But, the West, of course, is this political construct. It's not about geography. It's this transatlantic imperial construct that was created at the end of World War II, the idea of the West. I mean, in World War I and World War II, the so-called West went at war with itself. Both World War I and World War II were inter-imperialist wars waged by the imperialist European powers. So the West is a kind of new political construct. But anyway, it's useful in a lot of ways to lump Europe and the U.S. and also Australia and New Zealand together as the so-called West, right? And they have a lot of similarities in their political model and economic model. And if you look at the Western economic model, roughly during the first Cold War, from the 50s until the late 70s, and then the 80s until today, there are two different periods for the economic model. There's the Keynesian period and the neoliberal period. Of course, they're both forms of capitalism, but different forms of capitalism. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, not only in Europe, but also in the US, you had much more state intervention in the economy, and you had a bigger social safety net and a welfare program to protect workers, to basically to prevent a socialist revolution, to create a kind of safety valve to prevent the working class from, rising up and overthrowing the capitalists, like happened in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba. So that period, as I said earlier, ended in the 1980s when the Western capitalist class no longer feared socialist revolution. They were strong enough that they were winning the first Cold War, and they could start imposing neoliberalism and take away all of those social benefits that existed. And we see that ever since then, we see more austerity measures, a decline in real wages. In the US, real wages have declined since 1976. That was the peak of real wages. And now, of course, with inflation, we see that real wages have, in the past few years, they were increasing, but now with inflation, real wages are declining again because wages might increase, but then inflation rises more than the wages increase. So actually, you're getting a pay cut in terms of your real wage. And in Europe, it's a very similar process. And this brings us to the neoliberal era. I mentioned that in the Keynesian era, even Richard Nixon, the right-wing Republican US president, famously said, we're all Keynesians now, in the sense that they all recognize that the US government had to intervene in the economy to prevent these big corporations from dominating all industries, to prevent the big banks from just gobbling up real estate, like what's happening now. We see these vulture funds like BlackRock is the largest. These vulture funds these asset management firms are the largest landlords in the world. And increasingly, a lot of people in the United States, they don't even have a horrible person in flesh and blood as a landlord. They have a bank or an asset management firm that manages trillions of dollars of assets as their their landlord. So we're seeing this financialization and landlordization of these Western neoliberal economies. Michael Hudson, the economist, talks about this idea of the rentier class, as in like renting. It's a French term, like the rentiers or rentiers. So basically, these Western economies have become so financialized in the neoliberal era that they're no longer even producing anything. You talk about deindustrialization. So basically, the deal worked out in the neoliberal era was, all right, we're going to send all your jobs abroad, but the people in the West will still be able to live comfortable middle-class lives because we have cheap consumer goods from Asia, largely from China, and we have cheap energy from Russia. So after overthrowing the Soviet Union, the US had basically this puppet regime in Russia, and Russia was selling extremely cheap energy to the US and to the European Union. Especially Europe, of course, was very heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas, really until this year. So that was the way that in the neoliberal era, they said, okay, we've taken away the social safety net and all of these programs, but at the very least, you can buy cheap consumer goods from China and you have cheap energy. So that keeps the cost of living down. So even though your wages have been declining in real terms, at least you still have a more comfortable standard of living because we can keep energy prices low and the price of consumer goods low. Well, two major things have happened since then, right? One, the rise of Asia. China has lifted more than 800 million people out of absolute poverty, the largest poverty alleviation program in human history. And the standard of living of Chinese workers has drastically risen by 400%, which means that the average Chinese worker gets paid higher wages now. So that means that the cost of the goods produced in China has also risen because as China has helped raise people out of poverty and raise their standard of living, people are no longer, working long hours for low wages. They actually have more purchasing power and they can compete with people in these Western economies, which means that the price of those consumer goods in the West has increased and it's no longer like it was in the 1990s. And then, of course, the other significant factor is that Russia is no longer an option for Europe in particular to buy energy from because of these sanctions. And if you look at a graph of where countries in Europe were importing their energy from 1 year ago, as recently as 1 year ago, the plurality of oil and gas into Europe was coming from Russia. And if you look at certain countries in Central Europe, around Germany, a vast majority, up to 90% of their energy was coming from Russia. Now, the European Union and the US is basically telling these countries to bankrupt their domestic industry because they can't import cheap Russian oil and gas. And we also see that OPEC, the oil producing organization, bloc, OPEC has said that they are refusing to increase their oil production because, first of all, a lot of these countries are at capacity. They can't just magically pump twice as much oil. You have to have the infrastructure to do that. And a lot of them are already at peak capacity. And furthermore, a lot of them are enjoying the high prices. It's helping these oil producing countries. The government is making more money. Russia right now is making more money than ever before. So basically, the neoliberal economic model, it was based on the idea that the US could impose neoliberalism around the world and there would be free trade around the world. So countries could not have protectionist policies to protect their local industry from these massive Western conglomerates that would destroy local industry, like we saw what happened in Mexico with NAFTA. Well, that neoliberal order has been in decline for the past 20 years. And furthermore, we no longer have the cheap consumer goods from Asia and the cheap energy from Russia. So the neoliberal Western economies are in fundamental crisis right now. And that's why we're seeing this massive inflation. And the solution to this inflation is not simply increasing interest rates, which is what the Federal Reserve and the European central banks are talking about doing. That's a short-term Band-Aid. what we're seeing is the collapse of this neoliberal economic order that was constructed by the United States based on this neoliberal model of globalization, where resources and cheap labor were exploited in the global south, and then that wealth was taken into the imperial core. Well, largely because of the rise of Asia, that model is no longer going to work. And so when we're seeing this new Cold War, it's also the second Cold War is also an attempt by the Western colonialist powers to re-subordinate the global south and to turn them back into resource extraction hubs and cheap factories to create consumer goods so the West can enjoy that lifestyle that it enjoyed in the neoliberal era.
As always, brilliant analysis from Ben Norton. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to the audience as well. We will see you on the next episode of The Watchdog here on Mint Press News. Thank you very much.